content of this channel is for mature audiences. Parental discretion is advised. You're tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell notification button. And please, feel free to share the video. Thank you.
And let me get right into the main scene, man. Cut all this off, man, because I'm trying to get in and get out and do this and be done with it. I'm going to have to close OBS real quick and then start it back. So I'll drop out for one quick second and come right back in. I don't know what's going on with OBS, man. Lately, it's been acting finicky. real finicky. It won't, 1 minute it'll act right, the next minute it won't. So I had to shut it down and start it back up. Well, at any rate, what I'm doing is reading Raymond Connell's Masculinities. And yesterday I read the first part, well, like at least the first third of chapter 1. I'm going to read a little bit more of it, not very much of it, but at least about 8 pages. And just to finish up the section that I had started yesterday. And after that, I'll offer a critique of that entire section. Shout out to Destro, Trail Brentley. I see you out here, Miss Sunkissed. Ramona O'Bree, you can dialogue if you want to. I'll leave a link when I get through doing what I'm doing. Hey, Mrs. KP Bailey, and I see you, Shadow Observer. I don't expect a lot of people to be here. This is not, the most titillating and scintillating subject. But I think it's of import because if you want to know what's being said by liberal progressives about masculinity, well, I think that you need to go to the academic researchers and people who are critical of it. And so therefore, I'm doing just that. So having said all that, man, let me get right to what it is that I came here to do. I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to go to the window, to the wall. I know this thing is open. It is. All right. So the last time I was talking about, this book, and the last time we read from it, we were covering one of the ways in which masculinity has been defined or outlined in Western culture. And we found, according to the author, Connell, that in the course of the 20th century, there have been 3 main projects for a science of masculinity, okay? One is based on clinical knowledge acquired by therapists. Specifically, we're talking about Freudian theory. The second project for a science of masculinity is social psychology, and is predicated upon the idea of sex roles. And the third, the author says, involves recent developments in anthropology, history, and sociology. So what we're doing right now is we're looking at the first project for a science of masculinity, and that's Freudian psychology. All right. And I'm not going to retrace my steps here. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Okay. So if you want to have some insight into what was said thus far, you can go look at the first video on masculinities that I put out. All right. So where I left off was this section called Radical Psychoanalysis, okay? And the author says, the first dissident analyst, and this is a dissident psychoanalyst, okay? This is a dissident to the psychoanalytic tradition developed by Freud, picked up by Jung, picked up by, especially as it pertains to masculinity and femininity, picked up by Erik Erikson, and then picked up by Robert Stoller. But if you want to know what that trajectory is in time, you need to go and look at the first video. But anyway, the first dissident analyst was Alfred Adler, okay? A socialist doctor convinced of the importance of social factors in disease, okay? So this person, Alfred Adler, wants to figure out what are the social factors in the development of disease. Okay, he was the president of the Psychoanalytic Society in Vienna at the time of his split with Freud in 1911. Okay, the occasion of the conflict was a series of papers read to the society by Adler, and it is a remarkable fact that their centerpiece was a theory of masculinity. So this man, Alfred Adler, was a dissident to the psychoanalytic tradition as it pertains to arguments related to gender, and what he read to the Psychoanalytic Society in Vienna led to a split with Freud in the early 20th century, okay? Adler's argument started from the familiar polarity between masculinity and femininity, but immediately emphasized the feminist point that one side of the polarity is devalued in culture and is associated with weakness. Now, it doesn't take a great stretch of imagination to understand what is being implied here, namely that femininity is one side of the polarity that is actually devalued. So, going on, children of both sexes being weak, and I think we can all agree that children of both sexes, when they're young, before they reach, puberty, are relatively weak, okay? Being weak vis-a-vis adults, especially in comparison to adults, are thus forced to inhabit the feminine position. So what that means is, whether you're male or female, before you reach puberty, you are, according to the author and according to these psychoanalysts, you are in the feminine position. Man, this stuff is crazy. Okay, you're in the feminine position. They develop a sense of femininity and doubts about their ability to achieve masculinity. The childish value judgments about the masculine-feminine polarity persist as a motive in later life. So this experience can be projected into later life. This is one of the things that these psychoanalysts are arguing, okay? Submission, and I think every child has to submit to an adult. They have to, especially if their nurturance is connected to an adult, male or female. Submission and striving for independence occur together in the child's life, setting up an internal contradiction between masculinity and femininity. In normal development, some kind of balance is struck. The adult personality is thus formed out of compromise and exists under tension. So an adult personality reconciles, I guess, these contradictions, these internal contradictions between masculinity and femininity. But if there is a weakness, and Adler had the idea that neurosis was often triggered by some physical weakness or inferiority, there will be anxiety, which motivates an exaggerated emphasis on the masculine side of things. This masculine protest, in Adler's famous phrase, is central to neurosis. It means overcompensation in the direction of aggression and restless striving for triumphs. Now, if you want to have a direct line to the concept of what hypermasculinity is all about, there you have it. There you go. If you want to understand what hypermasculinity is all about, there it is. It's triggered by your neurosis related to your weakness, and then there's an overcompensation which leads to aggression. This is, at least is how it's framed in the psychological tradition. Anyway, Adler considered the masculine protest to be active in normal as well as neurotic mental life. It was not far from this idea to a critique of conventional masculinity. The masculine protest was a feature of women's psychology as well as men's. Uh-oh. So women also have the masculine protest. However, there's a qualification, okay? It is overdetermined by women's social subordination. So the masculine protest doesn't appear as strongly, I would assume, in women related to their social subordination. In men, it could become a public menace. Adler took a highly critical view of dominating masculinities, commenting on, quote, the arch evil of our culture, the excessive preeminence of manliness. Adler worked in Austrian military hospitals during the Great War and was left in no doubt about the connections between masculinity, power, and public violence. In 1927, his book, Understanding Human Nature, made a clearer statement of a psychoanalytic case for feminism than was found anywhere else until the 1970s. As an account of the sources of neurosis, this had moved far from Freud's libido theory. Adler criticized the theory of repression as mechanistic, and he saw the Oedipus complex as only one form that might be taken by a larger dynamic, a stage of the masculine protest. So, putting this in lay language, Freud basically said that you have to pass through the Oedipus complex stage, where if you're a child, you begin to envy your father and you want to castrate him, primarily to compete for the affection of your mother, okay? And you see your father as a threat. This is a necessary stage in Freud, but for Adler, it is only one form of protest that might be taken up by an individual during the stage of masculine protest. Anyway, on both points, he anticipated later theory. But Freud rejected Adler's view as an unwarranted simplification of neurosis, and the author says, and was certainly right in that. Judging that he no longer needed their support, Freud forced Adler and his followers out of the psychoanalytic movement. Yes, BGS, I'm on early. I'm trying to get this over with, okay? So at any rate, Freud said, fuck you, Adler. You're fucking with my theory, and you're wrong. Get out. Now, of course, Freud must have had a lot of power in his discipline in order to force the sitting president of the Psychoanalytic Society out of the movement. That's power. But anyway, there was a split, and it was a loss for both sides. Connell argues Adler lost touch with Freud's marvelous sense of the intricacies of mental life and never did theorizing of such quality again. So Adler was at a loss because of the split. On the orthodox side, psychoanalysis became an increasingly closed system, resisting precisely the issues of social power that Adler had raised. Shout out to T Fitness for You. Thank you, sir, for the donation. Appreciate that. Back to the matter at hand. Those issues were, however, taken up by other intellectual movements: Marxist psychoanalysis, existentialism, and feminist psychoanalysis. Now, I don't want to get into this just yet, but you'll see why a little bit later. Anyway, the many attempts to link Marxism and psychoanalysis circled around the issue of masculinity without directly addressing it. So they wanted to link Marxism and psychoanalysis together, but they really didn't touch on the issue of masculinity directly. They just kind of tap danced around it, okay? William Reich, perhaps the most original mind in the Freudian, left between the wars, developed a method of character analysis which shifted attention from the individual symptom to the style of the entire personality. Okay, so this researcher, William Reich, said, well, let's not look at individual symptoms, but let's look at the entire personality. Let's study the entire personality of the individual. His attempt to synthesize Marxist economic analysis and Freudian sexual science led to a brilliant analysis of ideology. This highlighted the authoritarian family as the site where the reproduction of class society and patriarchy is accomplished. Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism, published only 3 years after Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, is a world ahead in the sophistication of its social science. Reich's concept of a condensation of larger structures of authority and the psychodynamics of the family provided exactly the dimensions of social realism that Freudian and Jungian speculation about masculinity lacked. So if you want to know, if you must know, the idea that patriarchy is replicated and reinforced in the micro and the macro, here you go. So, one could talk about patriarchy existing microcosmically in the domain of family life or domestic life, and then you could also see it represented macroscopically in social life writ large, okay? Anyway, but Reich lacked the appreciation of feminism that illuminated Adler's work. Now, this is just the author, right? This is Connell speaking. So he did not treat masculinity itself as a problem. And here we go, this innate idea that masculinity in and of itself is a problem, right? But I'm not gonna, go into that right this second. Nor did the Frankfurt School theorists of the next 2 decades, who picked up Reich's idea of character analysis, his concern with authoritarianism, and his project of reconciling Marx with Freud. Now, I'll just have you know that during, the early part of the 20th century, Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxian theory were like high theory. Okay, this was like, I guess, like intersectionality would be for us today. Okay, I mean, these were the it theories. Okay, Marxism and Freudian psychoanalysis. Okay. In the work of Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Theodor Adorno, and these are all Frankfurt School critical theorists. In the work of Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Theodor Adorno, authoritarianism gradually emerged as a distinct character type. Okay, so this idea of wanting to be in charge. So if you want to get some insight as to the development for, I guess, Connell, this idea of hegemonic masculinity, this would be the seeds of that, right? The early manifestations of this in other people's thought. So authoritarianism gradually emerged as a distinct character type, or if looked at with feminist eyes, a type of masculinity. Okay, the most famous psychological works of the Frankfurt School, Fromm's The Fear of Freedom and the collective work, The Authoritarian Personality, were in effect catalogs of masculinities and the conditions that produce them. Fromm suggested a broad historical succession of character types over several centuries. The authoritarian personality worked at much closer focus. It included two famous case studies, Mac and Larry, which are the first detailed clinical pictures of masculinities carefully linked to the economic and cultural settings in which they emerged. So if you want to know what the earliest case studies related to masculinity are, they're the famous case studies of Mac and Larry in Fromm's work. Okay, the authoritarian type was a masculinity particularly involved in the maintenance of patriarchy, marked by hatred for homosexuals and contempt for women, as well as a more general conformity to authority from above and aggression towards the less powerful. So you see hierarchy here, right? And then you also see, the idea that homosexuals are incorrigible derelicts, and there's also this, misogyny taking place, okay, in the authoritarian personality type. These traits were traced back to rigid parenting, dominance of the family by the father, sexual repression, and conservative morality. So the authoritarian personality can be traced back to strict parents, a household that's patriarchal, led by a father, sexual repression, and conservative morality. Hey, this is what the author is saying. The democratic character was less clearly drawn, but included markedly more tolerance and was linked to more relaxed and affectionate family relationships. Okay? Here was empirical evidence of diversity in psychosexual character within the same broad social setting. Anthropologists influenced by psychoanalysis, such as the great ethnographer Branislaw Malinowski, had already shown the diversity between cultures in their handling of sexuality and their shaping of character. So in essence, okay, so Branislaw Malinowski is an evolutionary biologist, okay, and ethnographer. And for the most part, he's basically arguing that different cultures handle sexuality differently. It's not all just one size fits all. Like, different cultures have different concepts of gender and sexuality. So that's what's being expressed there. It became increasingly clear that Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex cannot provide an analysis of masculinity in general. This is, rather, a map of one historically possible pattern, and it is necessary to think about this particular pattern in relation to the others. This conclusion has broad implications for a theory of masculinity, which I will explore in following chapters. The author goes on to say, neither Wright nor the Frankfurt School shared Adler's doubts about the theory of libido. We all know what libido is, okay? But such doubts were proclaimed by Jean-Paul Sartre in Being and Nothingness. This is the existential philosopher. Sartre saw empirical psychoanalysis, as he called the Freudian school, as too mechanical. Again, there's the reference to mechanics and necessary steps, logical sequences, right? Taking one possible form of life determined by sexual desire for the condition of all lives. So according to the author, this is too, and even for Paul Sartre, the people she's referring to, the idea is that Freudian psychoanalysis is just too rigid and mechanical. And it doesn't take into account the fact that there are different possible forms of life, a healthy sexual, psychosexual life, as opposed to the one that, he proffered as being the norm. Anyway, Sartre outlined a striking alternative, which he called existential psychoanalysis. He replaced the concept of the unconscious with an argument about the different ways our self-knowledge is organized. Okay? The mystery in broad daylight could be unraveled by tracking back down the life history to establish the primary commitments through which a person's life had been constituted. I don't see how that's really much different than Freud, but, okay, whatever. Sartre himself applied the method only in literary biography, which to me is basically some made-up bullshit, but whatever. Sartre himself applied the method only in literary biography. It was Simone de Beauvoir who applied existential psychoanalysis directly to gender in the second sex. I know at least one person in this space has asked me to cover Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. So at some point I might do that. Anyway, her best known argument showed women being constituted as other to the male subject. And of course, this is an extension of French philosophy, existential philosophy, this whole idea of the other or alterity, within the context of a binary, but a hierarchical binary. Okay, not a apositional complementary binary, but, a subordinate binary or a hierarchical binary. But the book also included a series of essays on different types of femininity, which gave a much more active place to women's desires. Existential psychoanalysis allowed her to move beyond the static typologies familiar in psychology. Gender emerged in her treatment as an involving engagement with situations and social structures. Different gender forms are different ways of life rather than fixed character types. So if you want to know what the genesis is of the distinction between sex and gender, you can begin to see the early seeds of it in the work of Simone de Beauvoir. And it's predicated upon the work, again, of Sartre. Okay? So, as far as I know, this approach has never been explicitly applied to the first sex as a theory of masculinity. But the potential for doing so is clear in the work of the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing. Laing's studies of schizophrenia produced vivid pictures of men's activities in the emotional interior of families and a few individual case studies of men. These included the case of David, a student who studied eccentricity provided a clue to a whole life stuck together from discordant dramatic roles. The most powerful of these dramatic roles were women's, drawing their emotional impact from a family dynamic set up by his mother's death. David's schizophrenia was a consequence of his grappling with unmanageable gender contradictions. In escaping his feminine identifications, David set up a whole series of other personae, which now formed an elaborate false self-system. Now, I don't know what study, the author is referring to. I just don't know. I've never read about David and his schizophrenia. I just don't know what the reference is. Anyway, this is not a type of masculinity. In existential psychoanalysis, the contradictions of gender are not fixed, and their result is not an identity. They are produced socially, but they become contradictions precisely by being taken up as an incompatible course of action, or as incompatible courses of action. This approach to personality can connect to theories of social structure, but it does so by an emphasis on engagement and action, not social mechanism. Apart from Simone de Beauvoir, there was little interaction between feminism and psychoanalysis between the early 30s and the late 60s. Yet the radical potentials for psychoanalysis gradually emerged in feminist thought in two main forms. The first comes from Lacan, another French philosopher, and people influenced by him, such as Juliette Mitchell in Britain and Luce Irigaray in France. Okay, have been more concerned to theorize femininity than masculinity. Okay. Now, I have some things to say about Irigaray at some point, but there's a paper I want to read to you at some point that has a discussion about her position on femininity. And I think it elides into essentialism, which I don't like. But anyway, yet this work has an implicit account of masculinity. Lacanian theory focuses on symbolic processes in which Freud's model of the emotional relations of the family are writ large. The law of the father constitutes culture and the possibility of communication. Here, masculinity is not an empirical fact, as in classical psychoanalysis, still less an eternal archetype as in Jung. It is, rather, the occupant of a place in symbolic and social relations. I mean, a lot of this shit is just, what can I say, man? I know the terminology is kind of graduated. At some point, I can try to break it down to you if you have any questions. I mean, but ultimately what's being said here is that the author has traced a series of steps of how various psychoanalysis interpreted the unconscious and how identity is formed, psychosexual identity is formed within the individual, or personality or identity in general, okay? Of course, we know Freud's model is considered to be mechanistic, but Jung moves to archetypes, okay? Oedipal repression creates a system of symbolic order in which the possessor of the phallus, assembled to be clearly distinguished from any empirical penis, is central. So the phallus takes up a symbolic kind of meaning. It has a symbolic meaning. Treating gender as a system of symbolic relationships, not fixed facts about persons. So the symbolic relationships of gender exist outside of the person in these archetypes. This reminds me of Platonic formal theory, if you ask me, but I'm not going to even move towards that direction. I don't want to lose you. It is always possible to refuse it, though the consequences of refusal are drastic. Deleuze and Felix Guattari explored rejection of the Oedipal structuring of desire in their obscure but influential Anti-Oedipus. This provided the basis for Guy Hockingham's dramatic reading of homosexuality for men as a rejection of phallic sexuality and Oedipal repression. So this is, like a kind of psychoanalytical explanation for why some men endorse homosexuality, okay? While Lacanian feminism in Europe suggested a political symbolic reading of masculinity, North American feminism turned to the mundane issue of family relationships. Boy, don't we know it. And crystallized an important shift in thinking about boys' psychosexual development. In classical psychoanalysis, the drama has centered on the Oedipal entry into masculinity, whether the key agent was the father, as Freud thought, or the mother, as Horney thought. In the work of Nancy Chodorow and Dorothy Dinnerstein, the drama centers on the pre-Oedipal separation from femininity, with the focus definitely on the mother. So you got different psychoanalysts who have different ideas about where, the bulk of your psychosexual identity takes place. Is it the pre-Oedipal stage? Is it the Oedipal stage? Whatever, okay? Anyway, Chodorow's account of this separation has had a large impact on recent writings about men. She proposed that boys are pushed to disrupt their primary identification with the mother, partly by the mother's own emotional investment in gender difference. My little man, you my little man. bitch, my little man. Let me stop, man. Okay, anyway, she proposed the boys are pushed to disrupt their primary identification with the mother, partly by the mother's own emotional investment and gender difference. This results in character structures that emphasize boundaries between people and lack the need for relationship that is characteristic of women. Now, you know, this shit right here, like, just look, you got to read between the lines here. So what's being said is that boys, by being pushed away from their mothers, often at the hands of their mothers, because the mothers want to reinforce a particular kind of social gender order, right? That this distance between the boy and the mother creates distance between the man and other persons later on in his life. So there becomes, you know, a lack of need of closeness or togetherness with other people, whereas women maintain their sociality precisely because they're not pushed away from the connectiveness of their mothers in their formative years. But then this begs the question to me, are all women just fucking social? Like, I mean, like, this is, to me, this is a presumption. Like, there are no women who are loners and don't like to be around people. That's just the way I see it, man. Anyway, Dinnerstein's argument gave greater emphasis to pre-Oedipal fear of the mother and to men's violence as a consequence of the female monopoly of early child care. Okay, so men are violent because women have more connection to the babies or whatever. Okay, I mean, this also seems like a presupposition, but that's just my viewpoint. Anyway, here the development of personality is connected firmly to the division of social labor. Child care is work. Here we got, you see the Marxism right here. The workforce is gendered. This fact matters for emotional development. However, we modify the details. This simple and powerful argument must be acknowledged in any future account of the formation of masculinities. Looking back, it is clear that while Freud gave us an essential tool, it was radically incomplete. And psychoanalytic orthodoxy consists of defending this incompleteness. Ultimately, the work of psychoanalysis in understanding masculinity will depend on our ability to grasp the structuring of personality and the complexities of desire at the same time as the structuring of social relations with their contradictions and dynamisms. It's a lot of fucking, obscure terminology, but I mean, ultimately, the idea being put here by this author is that, look, Freud started something. He started the understanding, according to the author, that gender identification is something that takes place through a process and is not just given, predicated on your biology. Like masculinity doesn't necessarily stem from biology as much as it is the product of family relations, mother and child and father. And the concrete nature of those kind of relationships, whether they were functional or dysfunctional, whether the father was of a certain kind or another, had an impact on how the gender identity formed in the individual. Okay, it wasn't just something given by biology. So this is why the author is actually looking at this in the first place. Just to let you know, just to give you some insight. Okay. So also there's a reference here, because this is the last paragraph, so I want to sum it up of this section. So, those people who want to hang on to, the author says, like psychoanalytic orthodoxy is going to defend the incompleteness of the findings of Freud, which are further developed in the other thinkers that were mentioned as I read the last section. Ultimately, the work of psychoanalysis and understanding masculinity is going to depend on our ability to what? To understand the structuring of personality, understanding the complexities of desire, and understanding at the same time the structuring of social relations. Because there's going to be contradictions, and the whole idea of dynamisms just refers to the fact that it's not static, it's not rigid, it's fluid, it's changing. So anyway, the observation leads us directly towards the social sciences. Now, I'm not going to go into the social sciences. I'm not about to do that today. I'm going to hide this, get rid of that. Are there any questions at all? Is anybody confused about anything at all? Shout out to Miss Sunkiss. Appreciate your donation, man. Appreciate that. Okay, so here's my assessment of the first section. You know, so the author seems to think, Raymond Connell seems to think that Freudian psychoanalysis, or at least, you know, the findings about how sexual identity is developed can be useful, okay, for an assessment of masculinities, for this political undertaking, okay? I see I got one question, but I want him to make it brief. Chaos, what's going on? How you doing, bro?
What's good? What's good? My question, part 2 of masculinity. This is from a European author in regards to his breakdown of masculinity. That's my question.
Correct.
Okay. When was this? Is a book or is it a PDF?
This is a book. It's a PDF. You can look for it, find it online. It's called Masculinities. It's written by Raymond Connell.
When was it released?
I think the first edition was released in 1990, the early 1990s.
Okay, so 32 years ago. Okay. I guess that's my only question. Yeah.
Okay, so let me get back to this, bro. I mean, you know, but you can find it online. Look up Raymond Connell, Masculinities. You'll see it.
Okay.
Okay. So within the confines of the conversation about masculinity, so the author, first of all, is saying if you want to understand what masculinity is about, or you want to, you know, examine theories about it, the first place that you need to go to is psychoanalysis, because that's where the first discussions about it emerge in Western culture that are explicitly used today. Okay. Next, you got, you know, the idea of sex roles. And then after that, you got social science, history, and anthropology. So I haven't even gone into the idea of sex roles, nor have I gone into or undertaken the task of trying to lay out what's going on with anthropology and history, okay? But what I want to do is look at something real quick. I'm going to give me one quick moment. I want to share the screen again. I'm going to stop the screen from that. Share the screen. Go to the window. Okay. Let me start here. All right, so give me 1 second though. I'm going to take a quick break and I'll be right back. But when I come back, I'm going to explain to you my critique of the idea of psychoanalysis in general, like my reservations about the usefulness and, you know, the validity of trusting the findings of psychoanalysis in and of itself. So I'll be right back in 1 second. Take you to a quick commercial break right fast. All right, we back. I'm GG. Of course, you tuned in to the Green Gorilla channel. It's the place where black men can express themselves freely, straight up with no chasers. And so, let me make sure, man. I need to unshare this screen really quickly. I need to share it again because it's trying to do something I don't want it to do. Window. Give me 1 second, man. I need to get this straight. View, play. Okay. All right. That's where I want to be. Okay. So I'm going to tell you my issue with psychoanalysis in and of itself, is that it can't be falsified. That's my issue with it. Okay. That's my problem with it. Okay. So in order for you to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying about it, I'm going to go into, this whole spiel about what falsificationism actually is. All right. I've done it before, but I'm going to do it again. Okay. Now, I don't know if you know what falsificationism is, but it's the standard to determine whether or not a theory ought to be accepted as being valid within the confines of the scientific academic community. Okay. So I don't know if you know what the scientific method is really about, but ultimately it's about it's a epistemological method that's supposed to give us access or insight into the way the world actually is. That's what it's supposed to do. Okay, that's what science is supposed to do. And the criteria to determine whether or not a theory ought to be accepted to some degree is whether or not it can be falsified. Now, falsificationism is supposed to point to ways where we can improve on something called naive inductivism while holding on to core intuitions behind it. What is naive inductivism? Okay, naive inductivism is, and this is what science is in general, because science basically extrapolates and generalizes from particulars. That's what science does, and it gives us predictive power. Okay, you can't look at every event in nature. It's impossible. You can't observe everything in nature. You can't. No one can. Not even an entire community of persons at one time. Even 8 billion people observing something can't be in observance of everything. It's epistemologically impossible. Okay, but what science does is it utilizes the inductive method in order to make generalizations about the laws of nature. Okay? So, what is naive inductivism? Basically, when you have a large number of observations of X's, and this is just a formal argument, under a wide variety of conditions, and when all X's have been found to possess property Y, and when no instance has been found to contradict the universal generalization, all X's possess property Y. Now, there's some people who have an issue with this because they have a problem with something called the problem of induction. I'm not going to go into all of that. But then enter stage Karl Popper, who's an influential philosopher of science in the 20th century. So during the 1900s, this guy, Karl Popper, becomes influential. Many scientists agree with his ideas. He was a critic of Marxism. And what he tried to do was differentiate or demarcate, and I have the word in bold here. He wants to demarcate science from pseudoscience. Okay? Now, according to Popper, many of the theories behind psychology and sociology are actually pseudoscience. Now, I mean, I more or less agree with him, but I tend to be more generous as it pertains to social science than Popper does. But I will agree that there are some theories of psychology that really actually are pseudoscience. And not that, they're useless, but I mean, like, they can't be considered to be scientific. And you'll find out why in a second. So what he tried to do was point out why like a discipline like physics or chemistry is different from psychology and sociology, okay? Now, what Karl Popper says is that during the 18th century, Newtonian physics was popular, okay? And chemistry and physiology were yielding results, or physics or biology, okay? They were yielding results. People were finding out information about how the human body worked. They were finding out information about how chemicals interacted with other chemicals. They were beginning to find out what the periodic table of elements were. They were finding out all kinds of information. So people wanted to apply the methodology of science to a science of human behavior. It just stands to reason that if, you know, something's working in one domain, why not try and apply the methodology to another domain, okay? And of course, you all should know, if you don't know, you should know about the Age of Enlightenment. And the primary aim during this time was to develop a rational means to organize social structures. And Marxism and psychoanalysis were thought to have actually begun the process of fulfilling this goal. So Friedrich Engels, when Marx died, basically said that just as Darwin had discovered the scientific principles which underlie the development of species, Marx had discovered the scientific principles that lay under or undergirded the development of societies, okay? Sigmund Freud argued that his own discoveries were comparable to those of Copernicus. Now, I don't know if you know who Copernicus is, but he was the monk that kicked off a revolution which moved away from the geocentric model of the universe to the heliocentric model, meaning, in layperson's terms, that the earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is the center of our solar system, okay? Popper, at first, was fascinated by psychoanalysis and Marxism. But as he began to ponder on it, he began to become disillusioned by these kind of theories and called them pseudoscience. Now the question is why? Now he says that Marxism and psychoanalysis are successful when you think of them as the accumulation of theories and laws based on induction and generalization. Okay? They seem to be following, you know, the dictates of what good science requires. Okay? They provided numerous accounts to claim they could arrive at general principles based on observation of phenomena. Okay? But Popper argued that it is too easy to accumulate positive instances to support some theory, especially when the theory is so general in its claims that it seems not to rule anything out. So if your theory is put in such a way that everything can be explained by it, it's a theory that's too general to really actually give us any information about anything in a concrete way. That's what he's arguing, okay? So I always use the example of a theory that's general and that everything can be, you know, encapsulated within it. Psychological egoism. I know there's some men in the space that are psychological egoists or whatever the case may be, but psychological egoism is a descriptive theory that claims that people behave selfishly or they act out of self-interest. Now, I always ask people, give me an instance in which somebody is not acting out of self-interest or egoistically. Now, if you say, well, what about the guy in the military who, you know, throws his body on a grenade to save the life of his troops or, you know, of his fellow soldiers? And I would say, well, okay, he did it because, you know, he wanted to be known as a brave soldier and not a coward. So that's in his self-interest, or he did it out of selfish, you know, reasons. Or if you donate to charity, you do it for a tax write-off. You don't really give a fuck about poor people. I mean, anything that you can argue that somebody does out of an altruistic motive, you can reduce it to psychological egoism, right? So I ask students, refute the claim, okay? Now, the fact is this: you really can't falsify psychological egoism. It cannot be falsified. But according to Popper, if you have a good theory, you have to allow for the possibility of error and for revision and scrutiny. So, Popper says the same thing about Marxism, not just, psychoanalysis. I mean, I could go into the Communist Manifesto. I'm not really going to do that here, okay? But I mean, the basic thesis of the manifesto is, okay, and Marx thought he was doing science, okay? Popper says you're not really doing science, you're doing pseudoscience, okay? So the basic thesis of the manifesto is that the history of man is the history of class struggle. Class struggle is what pushes history forward, okay? So basically, society is originally classless. In an effort to make progress in production, you get this division of labor. Along with it comes a division of society into classes. The basic differences between these classes are economic. The division that obtains hinges around which class owns the means of production. Okay, so ultimately, you have primitive, classless societies to begin with. Then you get the emergence of slave-based societies of the ancient world. Then you get feudal societies of the Middle Ages, capitalist societies of the modern world, and then lastly, which is forecasted, there will be a return to communal classless societies. Okay, now this is what Marx is arguing. Okay, so here's a picture of a board, and the word bourgeoisie is rooted in the word bourg, and it's basically a walled town or a gated community. Okay, it's a group of people who got some shit that don't want other people to have access to it. Okay, simple enough. The word proletariat comes from the Latin word pros, which means offspring. And it's a reference to a class in Roman society that was so poor that the only thing they could give to pay taxes were their own children, okay? So the implication that Marx is trying to refer to is that there is a class in a capitalist society that is so poor that the only thing they have to give up is their work. So this is where you get the idea of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in Marx's thought, okay? But, Marx forecasts that capitalism is going to eventually lead to its own downfall. One is too large. The size makes it a monster that can't be controlled by private ownership. It's going to create, through its processes of large-scale production, an organized workforce that's going to eventually overthrow it. So, part one of the manifesto is basically about the development of the proletariat and the prophecy that, is going to eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie class. The condition of the proletariat is characterized as one that's going to become increasingly worse with the development of capitalist production. Human beings will come to be regarded more and more as machines or nothing more than commodities. You're going to get capitalist growth, which is going to lead to the disappearance of the other classes or more social stratification. Like eventually small mom and pop stores are going to disappear, and tradesmen and things like this. And then you're going to have like what you have today, like the big box stores like Walmart, Circuit City. I don't even know if it still exists anymore, but Best Buy. So you don't have like little mom and pop TV shops anymore. You don't have cobblers anymore. You go to the mall and you buy your shoes, okay? But simultaneously, the discipline of factory life and production is going to lead to a labor army that's organized. And it's going to become organized because capitalist production demands that it be organized for efficiency and making a profit. Now, according to Popper, there's a problem with Marxian theory because you cannot falsify it. It can't be falsified. In the same way that you can't falsify astrology because the predictions are too general. I mean, I'm not trying to knock anybody who does astrology, but the point here is that, come on, man, like, if you get a fortune cookie and shit, And it tells you, today you will have joy or some shit like that. Like, what does that mean, bro? Someone will come into your life, man, and bring you great joy. Someone will make you, within the next 30 days, someone will make you laugh. Like, that's not fucking science, bro. Okay? Because the predictions are too general. And they seek confirmation everywhere. Now, what does this mean? It really means that they don't make precise predictions about anything. They just usher forth generalizations that in the course of anybody's normal life is going to be true to some degree or another anyway. It's not really giving us much information about the human condition, okay? So what Popper argues is that when you start to talk about the history of worker safety laws and how OSHA exists in order to mitigate some of the concerns of the proletariat, what a Marxist is going to say, well, that's just stalling the impending revolution, like the Marxists or the workers' revolution. Like, but, you know, Popper is saying, look, you can't falsify any of the claims made in Marxist thought. You just can't do it. But it seeks confirmation everywhere. Everything can be explained in terms of it, okay? And according to Popper, the same holds true for Marxism. For psychoanalysis. You can't falsify anything Freud is saying because his theory seeks confirmation everywhere. And he uses two examples, Popper does. The first is a man pushing a child into water, intending to drown it, which is explained by arguing that the man suffered from repression, some repressed desire to create harm. But the second is of a man jumping in and sacrificing his life to save the child, which is explained by saying that he had achieved sublimation, which is, you know, letting the superego take over. So according to Popper, this is not a strength. Being able to explain everything is not a strength of the theory because all behavior can be explained by it, okay? So according to Popper, the central principles of both of these theories are so general as to be compatible with any kind of observations at all. There are no circumstances, or hardly any, under which they can be empirically refuted because they are like a lens through which to view the world. And here are the words of Karl Popper. The discovery of instances which confirm a theory means very little if we have not tried and failed to discover refutations. For if we are uncritical, we shall always find what we want. We shall look for and find confirmations, and we shall look away from and not see whatever might be dangerous to our pet theories. In this way, it is only too easy to obtain what appears to be overwhelming evidence in favor of a theory which, if approached critically, would have been refuted. Okay? And I'm not going to show that. That's a little skit I would have shown to students in a class. Okay? So anyway, Popper was impressed by the experimental confirmation of Einstein's general theory of relativity in 1917. Now he's saying, Popper is saying, what Einstein is doing is science. What Freud is doing is not science. What Marx is doing is not science. Because their theories are engaged in confirmation bias. But what Einstein is doing is actually science. So we can demarcate science from pseudoscience by a certain criterion. So let's look at what Einstein actually did that impressed Popper, okay? So Einstein predicted that light passing close to the sun should have its path bent by the sun's gravitational field. Now, Popper liked Einstein's theory because it made a prediction that was risky. It could have turned out to be false. It didn't have to be true. So what is a risky theory? Or some examples of risky theory. Newton's predicting that Halley's Comet would return during this time in 1758. Or Dmitri Mendeleev predicting the existence of a previously unknown element in the periodic table of elements, okay? Based upon, you know, what was already done before. He predicted that these elements actually existed, okay? So what is a risky prediction? It's basically a prediction that could turn out to be wrong, along with a willingness to reject the theory if its predictions are not observed. And this is what makes science respectable. Your theory has to be open to criticism and review. So I'm not going to carry it on further, but I say all of this to say, that I don't take too much stock in what people say about psychoanalysis. I just don't get off on it, man. I'm not saying it's absolutely unuseful, but to me, it's, especially as it pertains to gender, issues. To me, a lot of it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, man. I hate to say it. So I'm not gonna base, my understandings about what gender is. I'm not gonna put too much emphasis on psychoanalysis at all, as the author to some degree does, because he puts a lot of faith in what the early Freud has to say about the development of gender relations. Cool, but how does that really actually legitimate what it is that you're claiming? That's going to be my counter argument to Connell. No, there ain't no mods right now. And, I'm going to block them, man. I don't, look, I don't have any control over that. But anyway, I think I'm done with today. I left the link in the chat for anybody who has any questions. This shit is heady. This is heady stuff, man. Like, this is not easy to comprehend for everybody, I'm sure. But I think it's necessary. Because there's a lot of us out here who are talking about masculinity, and what do you mean when you're talking about it? You just talking about being aggressive? Or are you talking about being able to make money? Or what is it that categorizes, you as being masculine? Does it mean that you have testosterone? Like, what the fuck does it mean for you to be masculine? Does it mean you're able to have, access to sex? Does it mean you're successful? Monetarily? Like, what is it that determines, your masculinity? Does it mean that, you don't need attachments to other people? Like, you're a self-contained unit? What does it mean? So at least some people have begun to try to figure out, like, what it is and define it along some kind of lines. But for a bunch of guys to say that, like, they're men and, like, I'm a man and I'm masculine and they may, to make these consistent references to femininity and masculinity without having a precise definition about what the shit is, to me, it's just like, what are you doing? What are you referring to? That's like referring to my swag. Like, what the fuck is that? What is it? What does it mean? Oh, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. I can't define it, but I know what it is when I see it. That's not good enough. Especially if you consider yourself consistently to be talking about masculinity. And, my viewpoint on it is a lot of guys equate their success in the market with masculinity. Because they got some money. That, like, all of a sudden their masculinity. State Fresh says they think masculinity is being a patriot colonizer. Could be. But I don't necessarily think that's the way men in the black community think of masculinity at all. Although some people would try to argue that that's exactly what black men are trying to do, that they're trying to set up, like some sort of black nationalist, colonialist, segregationist state. Now, to me, that's absolutely absurd. But not to say it couldn't happen. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. But these are not the kind of arguments that black men are making at the current moment. I just don't see that. And I think that Connell's going to say the same thing. Like Connell says is going to end up arguing that there are different kinds of masculinities because masculinity is created in a social context. David Burt, that's what Connell is going to end up saying anyway, that the concept of gender is actually cultural. But I'm taking you through the steps. See, it's one thing to read some shit from a blog, and it's another thing to dig into the academic literature to figure out like where these people are getting these ideas from. It's one thing, to take, a course, a seminar or something like that and to find out the intricacies of it. And it's another thing to only get it as a byproduct of somebody's political opinion who hasn't even read the literature themselves. And to me, that's just socially irresponsible. You don't even know what the fuck you're talking about. I'm not speaking to you specifically or anybody specifically. I'm just saying people who regurgitate ideas who have no insight as to their origin are engaged in an intellectually lazy enterprise. That's what I'm saying. PK, what's cracking?
What up, GG, man? I've been looking for you, but this has been a good presentation you got today, man.
For sure. I ain't done with it yet, and I know it's not going to garner a lot of attention because a lot of guys are just into red pill rage or some shit like that. They just want to hear men just shit on women arbitrarily and just stay stuck in some. To me, it's emotion for real.
A lot of it is. I don't have an issue with people shitting on legitimate issues that they see. Got no problem with that, as long as it constitutes as a real problem. Now, I'm sure that I think that a lot of people would be able to you can measure it, obviously. Not everyone here can.
But I get pissed off at some, I get pissed off at the social condition of black men and some of the arguments that women make, especially if those arguments are influenced by a particular social class of black women whose real interests are only financial for real. They're only career orientated. Like many of these women don't even have like the average ghetto black woman experience. They don't even fucking have it.
Well, I don't think that the men, if we want to isolate this to black people specifically, even though the arguments didn't originate there, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, we're going to start there. When we talk about black women specifically, how do they measure masculinity in men? I don't think that they measure it the same way that black men do, and I don't think that black men in relation to white men measure it the same way either. I think we're all over the place. We all do, and really a lot of the measures were described by a lot of those people. You feel me? So.
Of course. But look, we live in a Western culture. That's just the bottom line. Like black folks act like they have like a unique culture that exists outside of the West. Right. And that we haven't adopted through osmosis, through, just enculturation. We haven't been heavily influenced by these people's norms and their cultural values.
It's proliferated. There are men. You see it all the time. I'm sure even in this space, men proliferate, a lot of these ideas knowingly or unknowingly, and it gets aped as if it were true. And there's problems with that. It's deeply fundamentally, problematic, and they don't even realize where the shit's coming from. Or why it's linked to a lot of this shit.
That's why I say I'm here to separate the wheat from the chaff. I'm here to give you the information. You can take it, like, not you personally, but anybody can take it and do what they want to with it. They can see it as a useless exercise. Fine. If that's how you perceive it, you know, that's how you perceive it. Okay? But, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you know, this author is going to say that there are different kinds of masculinities. That they're, like, I've heard the argument that there's masculinity is one thing, you know, and it emanates from biology. This author is going to say, if you start with Freud, you'll understand that the development of what masculinity is connected to a social practice or a social process. That's where your gender is formed. Now, I mean, personally, I'm not saying that there's no insight to be gained there, but I'm saying that in terms of being able to demonstrate it scientifically to either affirm or deny it, I don't think there's a lot I can go on there.
You can't. It's really, I tried to explain this a while ago. There's no measure for any of these things, not an objective one. And so that's one of the biggest problems when we try to, you know, argue some of these points, is that there's no real objective measure to how we identify these aspects of masculinity, you know. And so we try to come up and coin these phrases and ideas, you know, that have already been propagated by someone else in the first place, but that aren't necessarily true insofar as really men on the planet.
But here's the kicker, though. See, here's the thing, though. Despite the fact that masculinity might not be, or the way you so-called perform it, might not be uniform across all cultures and what have you, I don't think that can lead to a whole-scale denial that there's nothing that differentiates the human species into biological sexes. I think that's bullshit.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you know, of course, you know, you can argue, okay, there are going to be some women who have more testosterone than others, and there's some men who have less testosterone than others and shit like that. But I'm just saying, like, you know, generally.
Well, that's something that is measured by good science, like you said earlier. That's measured by good science, what you just defined.
But men and women, like, when you start talking about, like, there is no such thing as sexual difference, I'm going to say, man, come on, man, like, stop it. But, I mean, we're going to go into all of it. I'm going to read the first 3 chapters of this shit. I only got through half of the first chapter, but I feel like this is a useful exercise. Even if you don't agree with anything being said by this author, at least it could be a springboard for conversations about what other people have thought about what masculinity is and how you can differentiate between masculinity and femininity in the human species. Because, I mean, right now it's just a whole bunch of, hold on to your masculinity. Like, don't let anybody take it from you. Like, okay, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Like, I mean, you know, like a philosopher likes clear definitions, clear and concise definitions about the terms of which you're speaking. So I'm listening to a lot of this shit. Like, what the fuck do you mean?
Don't worry about it. Just fucking, you feel me. That's all it is.
I mean,
you feel me.
I make a lot of counter arguments to feminists. You know, see, the thing they end up doing, and as far as I'm concerned, the mistake they end up making is essentializing themselves as good and as victims, and then arguing that all of the pathology related to domination and control is centered within the male population.
Well,
I think that's bullshit.
That's the only framework that, at least in the West, that we've been trained to view it through, or they have. Us too. It didn't, you know, leave us unaffected. But that's the only framework through which a lot of this dogma is coming through, is essentially that, you know, in either case of how our society works and how men work and how women work is in a form of subjugation or domination or slave master relationship, essentially. Now, I mean, where did they get that from, right?
But I mean, you know, my viewpoint on all of this is to argue that, like, women don't want to dominate and control. They're typically more social and passive. You got to prove that. I see demonstrations of the opposite all day, every fucking day. I mean, think about it. If you go into a McDonald's and you mad they ain't got your shit right, so you go behind the counter, that sounds like some control issue shit to me. Or maybe I'm wrong. And I ain't saying men don't do it, but I'm saying women do it as well.
Not only men do it, as far as we're concerned.
I mean, like, say for example, like I showed a video where like a man was bringing food to his kid, and she didn't like the fact that he was bringing it the way he was, so she threw the shit on the street. That's a control issue. Or if you breaking up and you mad about some shit and you want shit your way, like when you act like women don't want shit their way, and anytime they desire for it to be their way, it's just a matter of them engaging in resistance against the patriarchy. To me, that's some bullshit. But we're not looking at any of this objectively. All we're using is the lens of white women who claim that, they are being like restricted from occupying equal status to that of the men, the most powerful men in the culture. And I just say, come on, man. That's like, if you know,
it's ironic.
It's really white. Yeah, if you know the history of white women, man, them motherfuckers. I got a lot of shit to read, man. I'm tired of going through these damn arguments about our differences or whatever the case may be, because we caught up in a proxy war with whiteness, and we'll never win that.
Nope.
There's no way for us to win that. But I just looked at this book. It's called White Women's Rights, The Racial Origins of Feminism in the United States by Louise Michelle Newman. Worth reading.
When was that?
It's the early 90s.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I don't think I've ever heard of it.
Well, it's the late 90s. It's 1999 when that shit was published. Okay, so this is a lot of shit that like people like Tommy Curry are referring to in their work. Louise Michelle Newman. Okay? That's another book written by a white woman called Measuring Manhood by Melissa Stein. And in this book, she talks about how gender categories were in part informed by ethnology or racial racial thinking.
A whole lot of shit is viewed through that exact same lens.
So I want to explore that. That shit interests me. All this old fuck these bitches. I mean, if you say fuck them, fuck them. What you need to have a conversation about it for? Like I'll try to warn guys, like, don't do this, don't do that. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you done, you done. Like, why even talk about it? Just be about your day. Be about your business. Keep it pushing.
Oh, it's a problem. It's a problem. About it. I agree. I think that in most, we can both say for sure, in most men's lives, not only do most men, not us specifically, they measure their masculinity through women in one measure or another. They generally do. And so because of that, this is going to be an ever-present conversation and at the forefront of men's minds, not even just black men's, but men's minds, especially in Western context and culture. That's just, we can't get away from that. So it's always going to be a topic that's talked about here and everywhere else. That's a part of the reason why it's so prevalent in talk shows, TV. Hell, one of the biggest things that people talk about on the internet, period, is sex and relationships. Always has been. So that's not going away, whether we like it or not. It's not going away. I think that you should, like you said, if you done, be done. But at the same time, as long as you're dealing with women, you're gonna face issues. So men are gonna talk about it.
Yeah. So but at the end of the day, man, it's interesting to have the discussion, man. I just want to move into, I'm worried about black men and black masculinity ultimately. Like that's what I'm ultimately worried about. Here we go with this old sexual bullshit. Like I wonder how they find a way to put that shit into my damn streams.
They do it everywhere. It's a bot. It's like everywhere.
Thank you, Kareem Austin. Appreciate the donation, bro. But again, man, it's an hour and 31. I wanted to get this done before 5 o'clock. Like before it gets into the 6 o'clock domain. But I appreciate you coming in to have a conversation with me. I know these videos are a little bit, cerebral, but go back and listen to them slowly. See what you can dig out of it, and put it in your conceptual toolkit and use it and deploy it when necessary. But we haven't really even gotten into it. We only scratched the surface. So, but I'm dedicated to, getting through it. So tomorrow I'm going to come and read the section on sex roles. And then after that, I'm going to read the section on history and anthropology. So I guess that'll be on Thursday. And then I'll break for a little minute because I don't want to hit you with brain overload. I'll break for, the weekend or something like that. Maybe talk about something else and then come back to this shit. So, but anyway, man, peace out, my brother. And thank you for the donation, Black Quiz. Appreciate that. He says, thanks for the book references. Just bought them. Cool, my dude. Read that. Read them, man. And I'm probably going to start at 4 o'clock. Sometimes I'll start at 5, but I just wanted to, I just wanted to get this done early, man. I might do it later tomorrow. I don't know, but just know I will be back tomorrow to finish that second section. That's what I'm going to do. So appreciate the donations, appreciate the support, and I'm going to sign off, man. I'm out of here. All right, my brother?
All right, man. I appreciate you letting me come up, man. Thanks for the talk, and thanks for the education that you're doling out, man. It's very important.
Appreciate you, man. Appreciate you. All right, man. All y'all be peaceful. I'll holler at y'all on the next one. Peace.